On this episode of China Unscripted, the Chinese economy is collapsing. But will the U.S. wise up in time to avoid a huge global crash? Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Matt Gnezda.
And I'm Shelley Zhang. And unfortunately, Chris can't be with us today because he's off doing kung fu in the mountains again.
But joining us today is Matt Turpin. He's a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, specializing in U.S.-China policy, and he's a senior advisor at Palantir Technologies. He was also formerly the U.S. National Security Council's director for China and the senior advisor on China to the Secretary of Commerce. And he also has a fantastic Substack called China Articles, which we'll put a link to below. Matt, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Matt.
Well, we're excited to have you here, and I recently read a chapter in The Boiling Moat that you co-wrote called The Myth of Accidental Wars. So could the U.S. accidentally trigger a war with China?
Well, certainly it may not be what we intend, but wars don't start by accident. They're intentional policy decisions. Certainly if a war were to erupt, it would be because Beijing wanted to start one, not because folks simply made a mistake. Mistakes are things that people don't intend to do. Wars are the most intentional things that humans undertake. I think it's a misnomer to talk about sort of accidental wars.
So if we fly an airplane and that kind of gets near Chinese airspace and they accidentally nix a Chinese jet that has come to intercept or something like that, that wouldn't actually accidentally cause a war. It'd be because China is already wanting to do something.
Well, it could cause an accident.
Right.
And certainly an accident could be very bad, and it could certainly harm or kill individuals that were involved in that particular accident. And it could be used as a pretext to do something that someone had already intended to do. But the idea that that would be the cause, and that neither side wanted a war, but they just accidentally found themselves in a conflict, seems a bit weird. It's just not a concept that seems to match with like how humans operate.
Yeah. I mean, an interesting corollary would be the 1999 bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, where the U.S., the initial U.S. report was, it was a total accident. And it may or may not have been an accident, that bombing of the Chinese military attache's office. But either way, it didn't actually cause a war between the U.S. and China. It did kill people, and it was something the U.S. did with military weaponry, and yet China didn't want to start a war over it.
Right. And again, it certainly can cause significant tensions and problems in a relationship. It could certainly complicate a whole bunch of things. But the idea that just because an accident happens, that means that essentially a war erupts seems like an unlikely outcome.
I think when you put it like that, it seems like, that makes sense that you'd have to intentionally go to war. But why is this kind of myth of accidental war so pervasive that you had to write, a chapter in a book about it?
Well, I think part of it is that it's, we have some folks who just probably don't think very much about war, right? I mean, it's one of these things where we've kind of gotten away from, and sort of, kind of a misunderstanding of how wars start, how they unfold, what leaders make this, how leaders make decisions about entering into a conflict. I think one of the things that I think is pretty clear to me is that leaders go to war because they think they're going to win. They don't go to war because they think they're going to lose. So it's about optimism, and it's about a vision of success, rather than a fear that the other side is threatening you and that you're forced to do this. That in many cases, when you feel threatened, you find other ways out of this, and you seek negotiation and those sorts of things. It's only when you feel supremely confident that you begin a war of aggression against a neighbor or against another power.
I mean,
Putin's invasion of Ukraine was not because he thought that NATO was strong and that Ukraine was strong. He thought it was because he thought those places were weak and that they wouldn't respond and they wouldn't be able to fight back. That's the rationale that leaders make when they make those decisions.
So, if that's the case, then the solution to ensuring we don't have war with China would not be to make sure we avoid accidents in airspace or naval space or whatever, but rather to erode Xi Jinping's confidence that he could actually win.
I think that's a good summary of how to do this. This gets us back to the concepts of deterrence, the idea that you need to be able to create in the minds of your rivals that they could not achieve the outcomes they desire through the use of force, and that it forces them to find negotiated methods to come to the solutions that they would like. But when your rival feels that they can use force to achieve the outcome that they want at a cost that is lower than what the perceived benefit will be, then the likelihood of them starting a conflict goes way up. Right? That's the logic that leaders will go through, and I think we've sort of lost sight of that. We've believed that in many ways that it's the United States is the only one with agency here, and therefore, if we provoke others, then that might force them into a conflict, or if we're too prepared, that's what might actually start a war. And I think that's a mistake.
That's almost weirdly self-centered.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think also it's interesting that like a lot of the U.S. policy towards China has, in terms of, it's kind of like trying to make the U.S. seem as unthreatening as possible, like make the U.S. small, like reassure China that, we are not trying to contain you, like all this kind of language where it seems like we're trying to make ourselves less of a threat. And from what you're saying, that might actually be counterproductive.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, my old boss, General H.R. McMaster, used to talk about, a concept about strategic narcissism, this self-centered look at your own actions and an inability to see that others have agency and they make their own decisions along their own logic and their own rationality of how they understand the world and make their own assessments. And when you get stuck into the mindset that essentially we in Washington are the ones that are driving all decisions, and that if we choose not to do something, like we choose not to enter into a Cold War, well, then there is no Cold War, right? As if others don't have the authority or the agency to make their own decisions and take their own actions. And that, I think, is a really dangerous situation because it leads us down a path of overconfidence in our own capabilities to shape the world, as opposed to being very realistic that others have real capabilities as well.
Now, you used to work for the U.S. National Security Council, and just this week we're seeing U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in Beijing talking with Xi Jinping, and I know they've got a bunch of things to talk about, but one of the things presumably they're talking about is how to increase communications to avoid war, perhaps, at least from Sullivan's perspective. Is that going to increase Xi Jinping's optimism about whether he can take Taiwan, or is it going to prevent a war like that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I don't, on the face of it, I do not object to the idea that we continue to maintain contact with the second largest economy in the world, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, right? These are all things we should be doing. We should have normal contact. My concern is that we have sort of communicated, or we have implied that we are far more interested in maintaining stability and finding off ramps and managing the competition and allowing our rival to then control the pace of it and feel quite confident that any action they take will not result in an escalation, because we will seek to slow it down and we will seek to find an off ramp. And that's a sort of a bad position to be in, because it emboldens the confidence of your rival to feel that they have the initiative and they can take chances and act in risky ways. So that's I think a challenge there. I suspect that some of the other topics that the National Security Advisor is raising are things around China's obvious and material support for Russia in its war in Ukraine, its threats against Taiwan, its threats against its other neighbors, the Philippines and Japan. We just had this week, the violation of Japanese territorial airspace, presumably for the first time. I mean, at least that's what the Japanese are reporting. And that happened, in the hours before Jake Sullivan arrived in Beijing. And so it's disturbing that we continue to sort of do these and create those impressions. And I think those impressions embolden Beijing to do more against us rather than reassuring them. They're reassured that we're going to back down.
And you said that this is not a good position for the U.S. to be in. What would be the best position for the U.S. to be in? And I guess, how can the U.S. get there?
Well, we made a couple of decisions about a decade ago around sequestration, around our own defense planning, in which we have essentially bottomed out sort of our defense spending as a proportion of GDP. And we constrained the way in which we sort of defined the way in which we would do defense planning around one major war. And that's the only thing we would plan for. Maybe in 2013, that was an acceptable conclusion to make about a relatively benign international environment. But we don't live in a benign international environment anymore. We have a defense spending as a proportion of GDP that is on the same level as we were at in the late 1990s. Sort of historic lows for the United States. In fact, of all the NATO countries over the last 2 years, there's only 4 countries that have reduced their defense spending as a proportion of GDP: Croatia, Italy, Greece, and the United States. So, as the rivalry and competition increases with Beijing, we have sent a message that we are not actually preparing ourselves for a potential conflict, which I think communicates to Beijing that they have an opportunity to do more aggressive things and that we won't be able to respond. And of course, that has to do with the multiple ongoing other conflicts that draw our attention away and our resources away. That's just the way the world is. It'd be great to be able to sort of ignore parts of the world, but fundamentally, we're going to probably have to recalibrate our spending to be able to match the threats that are out there.
I mean, I asked this of Matt Pottinger when he was on our show. One thing that the book The Boiling Moat talks about is like we need to increase the defense spending, just like you've been saying. And because it's a election year this year, talking about defense spending is not exactly a popular, talking point in terms of elect me and we will spend more on the military. So how do you think that U.S. officials or politicians can talk about this in a way that makes sense to the U.S. people?
I think it starts with leveling with the American people the situation that we're in. We've entered a new period of Cold War, and I mean that in a very specific sense. A Cold War is a hostile rivalry between great powers, each possessing nuclear weapons, which forces the competition into a variety of other sectors like the economy, into propaganda, into technology, and it forces us to do things and take more seriously sort of the geopolitical stakes that we find ourselves in, because it's really a battle over how does the world work, right? How does the international order work? And we've not, at least I haven't seen American political leaders level with the American people that that's the situation we're in. In fact, what we're in right now is, numerous leaders and officials adamantly saying that we're not in a Cold War, right? That this is not happening. That China and Russia are not allies, right? And it would seem to me that is objectively false on both counts.
I mean, Xi Jinping and Putin made pancakes together. I mean, if that's not friendship, I don't know what is.
Why do you think that the U.S. officials are saying we're not in a Cold War? Is this trying to signal to China, or like, is this like, are do they actually believe we're not in a Cold War?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is, I think, a desire to that if you don't admit something is happening, maybe it won't become real, right? That as long as you ignore it, maybe the problem will go away and it can resolve itself, and we can find a more mutually beneficial relationship. I think part of it is that there is a deep aversion to the idea that we would go back into a period of international affairs that that many of us saw as quite dangerous, and I think it absolutely was. But it's the least worst option for us right now. I mean, the reality is that we are in a deeply hostile rivalry with the threat of war erupting and ongoing conflicts that we are already in that are sort of allied to the PRC. And if we don't become serious about that and communicate to the American people about those realities, the risk for surprise and disaster goes way up, because you're simply not preparing yourself for the kinds of things you're actually facing. And so I think that's a dangerous situation to be in. The time to have made this argument was probably in the spring of 2022. And folks didn't make that argument then, and so it becomes much more difficult as they get closer to an election. So I know it's hard, and that's not what people want to hear, but I think it's better for us to sort of deal with reality as it is than to pretend that it doesn't exist.
Yeah. So, in the I guess call it the first Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the world was basically splitting up into these geopolitical blocks, right? And at the time, we called it First World, that is, the West, right? The First World, Second World, unaligned, and Third World, which was the communist countries. But what are we?
Second World.
Or sorry, communist Second World, Third World were like what we now call, I guess, developing countries.
Right.
But it's
yeah.
Well, so and now it's called the global. Like, what are the geopolitical blocks that we're seeing today? Are they the same? Are they different?
Well, I mean, I would contend that we now have essentially those same that same three world model. I think we have a global West, right? I mean, the idea of the term West is a little bit tough, just because we're talking about countries that exist around the world. Primarily Europe, the democracies of East Asia, Australia, North America. I mean, that's sort of the global West.
I mean, technically, Japan is really far west of the United States.
Exactly. Yes.
And possibly just north if you consider Guam.
Yeah. So, the directionality obviously is not the thing here. It's a concept. It's a stand-in term that we've chosen to use, and I think I would say that we've also got a global East, and increasingly that is the PRC, the Russian Federation, the Iranians, certainly the North Koreans. Probably you would put the Pakistanis in there, or maybe they are in the global South. I mean, a couple of these will sort of sit on boundary lines, and then we have a global South, which in many ways aligns with what had been the Third World or the non-aligned movement of the first Cold War, and we're now back into that same set of dynamics. It's not exactly the same. There are difficulties with sort of making analogies, but I would argue that it's a mistake for us to ignore the category of Cold War, and it's a mistake for us to ignore the categories of these different blocks. It's a heuristic to think about how these things work, as opposed to a direct analogy to what we went through between 1947 and 1991.
And so, if the U.S. were to sort of in a whole of government way look at our situation as a Cold War and as we're in this geopolitical bloc versus the China, Russia, North Korea, Iran bloc, how would that change things from the way they are now?
Well, I think it would sort of settle our minds on the idea that there is this budding division between Moscow and Beijing. I think we've got to sort of set that aside. That is likely not going to materialize any time while Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are alive. Those two leaders have likely made a set of conclusions about their own alignment that is going to be very hard to dislodge. And therefore, we probably need to be viewing them and treating them as a bloc so that they each suffer the consequences of each other's actions. Right now, even though we've imposed some sanctions on Chinese companies that are providing material support to Russia's war machine, the Chinese economy, while not doing very well, is not necessarily suffering all of the consequences that would come from China's almost full-scale support of the Russian war effort. And so therefore, they get to sort of hedge between the two. And we should probably be pushing them closer together right now rather than pretending that they are still split.
Well, it seems that this is a potential good point of leverage for the United States. When looking at the Chinese economy, what are we seeing now that's different than it was a few years ago?
Well, the expectations of its sort of inevitable rise to dominance is now called into question. The assumptions that folks had made, a decade or 2 decades ago of essentially the sort of straight line GDP growth going out into the future forever, now that's called into question. And the expectations that China has entered into the middle income trap, and it's going to be very difficult for them to get out of it, is beginning to sort of set in to analysts and economists and business leaders around the world. And political leaders are starting to sort of internalize that as well. Now that is not complete yet, but that's starting to materialize. So really, the expectations about what's going to happen to the Chinese economy, that is changing, and I think we probably could have seen this a decade ago. China announced a series of economic reforms in 2013, which would have seen sort of liberalization of the Chinese economy, a reducing of the state's role in how the economy works, all things that Chinese economists agreed with sort of economists in Europe and the United States and other places that China had to do to reform its economy, given its movement from a really poor developing country into this sort of middle income status. They needed to change the way their economy operated. They announced those reforms, but they didn't follow through with them. And so it's a decade later, they have not made the changes they knew they needed to make. And they're living now in a much more sort of hostile international environment, and it's much more difficult for them to make those changes. And so I think it's increasingly clear that Xi Jinping and his immediate cadres simply lack the will to carry through those reforms, because those reforms would reduce the power of the Chinese Communist Party, and they're unwilling to make that trade-off.
I mean, it's a tough position to be in, and Xi Jinping's not stupid. He's probably a very, very smart guy. So he'd rather hang on to power at the expense of potentially crashing the entire economy.
And I think he's anticipated this. I mean, this is one of the big reasons for all the investments in social control and all the internal security investments that he's made for the past decade, is the understanding that fundamentally it's probably going to get tougher for the Chinese economy to grow as it once was. That's going to lead to social unrest, and so therefore they have to make significant increases in being able to maintain social control. Right. So it isn't as if he just decided this in the last year. This has been a long-term assumption of how it worked. Now, of course, he would prefer the economy be doing really well, but that it's not doing particularly well, the options that he has make significant economic reforms that will inevitably lead to political weakening of the party is not something he's willing to comprehend, and would much rather sort of stick with what he has. And he has a ready-made boogeyman for why, to explain to the Chinese people why they're going through these problems. It isn't the party's fault, it's America's fault. America is doing this to us. And then to use sort of nationalism card to be able to play that out. And I think that's the dynamics we're watching play out. And so because they're unwilling to make their own changes to fix their own economy, they have to find an excuse, and it has to be the United States. And then that has sort of led us into kind of where we're at now.
How are they saying the U.S. is responsible for China's economic issues?
Well, we're containing them. And of course, according to the party, we've been containing them for a couple of decades. Even though we were making massive investments there, even though we were moving global manufacturing to China, the narrative is that we were containing them. And so that has sort of flown, it has come back into to sort of the mainstream of the way in which they portray themselves. Of course, you'd had some arguments in China, from those who had, probably greater exposure outside of China, that this was a false narrative. But those folks have been largely sidelined. And those who would look at this in purely sort of nationalistic and security terms have sort of risen to the fore. And we could see this from the 20th Party Congress and a whole bunch of decisions that Xi Jinping has made.
So clearly, as long as we keep reassuring the Chinese Communist Party that we're not containing them, then they'll stop saying we're containing them, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this is the dynamic we're in, right? So for their own purposes, they need to blame us for their economic problems. And we are unwilling to recognize the reality of what has come. Again, largely because if you assume that Washington is the only one with agency, therefore assuring others can convince them, as if they don't have their own reason for why they would come to these conclusions themselves.
What do you think about the economic reforms from the third plenum?
So, obviously we'll see how this plays out, but I think the overwhelming consensus from outside observers is that it was a bit of a nothing burger. It was a doubling down on Xi Jinping's approach and an unwillingness to bring back the economic reforms of the third plenum of the 18th Party Congress, right, a decade ago, right? So this is the sort of the continuation, business as usual, make the state-driven economy work more efficiently, rather than realize that the things that had gotten China to the place that they're at now had really been allowing the Chinese citizenry to unleash their own entrepreneurial passions and be able to be unencumbered by what the state would do. And that's just not the view that Xi Jinping has of how the economy works. So he's operating rationally from his own set of assumptions.
But I suppose that when other business leaders see, for example, Jack Ma being contained, let's say, disappeared for a while and then just backing off and kind of not saying anything critical, not put like
He's like semi-retired, essentially.
Right.
He had to let go
Teaching in Japan.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and everybody knows what really, all the business leaders understand what happened to Jack Ma, right?
Are you talking about Chinese business leaders?
Yeah, Chinese business leaders.
Yes.
Like they understand it, and so it's a warning to them. It's a threat, right? I mean, this has got to have some impact on how other businesses behave, and probably that trickles down as well into smaller businesses.
I think so. I think certainly U.S. businesses are far less excited about the opportunities in China than they were a decade ago. Now, I mean, you've got a lot of companies that have a bunch of sunk costs in China, and it's really difficult for them to pivot away. And I have sympathy for them. They would love for this all to resolve itself and they wouldn't, and we could go back to business as usual. That could be the heady days of the late 2000s, and they don't want this to be true. But increasingly, I think we're seeing that companies are making capital allocation decisions in which they are spreading their bets to other places.
What do you think? Because you work in the technology space too for like Palantir. What do you think is happening in Silicon Valley related to China? Because a lot of those companies, like you were talking about, have sunk costs.
Yeah. Again, I mean, it has to do with sort of where those companies are in their sort of maturity cycle, right? A company like Apple made a bet about manufacturing in China 2 decades ago, right? It's how Tim Cook got his job. I mean, he was essentially the one that advocated the building out of a manufacturing base in China, moving its supply chain there, and building out a manufacturing sort of powerhouse to be able to make Apple into the company it is today. And that was, objectively for Apple, a really successful move. But it was under a set of geopolitical conditions that were very different than what we have today. And that now that those geopolitical conditions have changed, and that China is changing internally, I mean, I bet if you were starting Apple today, you wouldn't build Apple like it's built today, right? You would build it a different way. You'd put your manufacturing someplace else. But of course, it's very difficult for Apple to do that, given where it is already. But it is beginning to make some serious investments to diversify its manufacturing in other places, a China plus one manufacturing policy. Yeah, and throughout ASEAN, and so that will play out over time. I think we should have sort of an expectation of how business cycles, how long they take to unfold, how long it takes for these things to be set up. But I think it's clear they began to think this through and consider these changes back in 2018, as the Section 301 investigation was completed. A series of tariffs were put in place. The Chinese put a series of tariffs on the United States. That began a set of thinking across boardrooms, across the U.S., across Europe, and Japan, to reconsider how China sat at the center of their manufacturing, and then to make some investments. I think for companies that are in China for China, it's going to be really difficult for how they would get out of that, right? That, like, they're selling there until they're forced through some sort of catastrophic event. They're unlikely to step out, and we shouldn't probably expect them to. I mean, they're going to make money there until they can't anymore.
What do you think about companies like TikTok, like companies that try to essentially be in the U.S. and China? I mean, TikTok's unique because its parent company is Chinese, but like this idea that you can have these multinational companies that can cross borders, like borders kind of don't matter, like the geopolitical situation isn't affecting them, like what you were saying people thought a decade ago.
Yeah. Well, I think I think we should be very clear. We're talking about ByteDance. TikTok is one platform that ByteDance owns. ByteDance controls the IP. ByteDance controls those sorts of the decisions that are made. TikTok is a business unit that sits underneath of it, that depends upon its parent company and make decisions. And so I think we should be very clear about that arrangement. In the past, I mean, for 80 years, the United States has made the decision that radio stations, television stations, things that provide news and media, that the FCC should have some degree. It should be able to be able to grant licenses over foreign-owned TV stations and radio stations. In the mid-1990s, we chose to exempt internet platforms from those kinds of restrictions. It's probably something we should rethink, given that large portions of our society now get their news from those media outlets and not those traditional media outlets. and that there was a reason why we did it back then, and that those are very legitimate reasons for why countries should take action to limit the ability of a hostile foreign power to manipulate opinions inside your own country. And worse yet, collect data and then potentially be able to use that for nefarious purposes. So it seems like a no-brainer to me of why we should be breaking that ownership structure. And I certainly hope that that's what unfolds in the next 5 or 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that the U.S. government, whoever is in the next administration, the next Congress, they have the political will to kind of follow through on what was passed regarding TikTok this year.
I mean, we should have had this in place before TikTok sort of rose up. I mean, it's just so much more difficult to do it after it becomes super popular, right? We should have put these provisions in place beforehand. We didn't. It's going to be more difficult now, but it'd be wise for us to then take these actions, impose some sort of level playing field, and then go forward from there.
Yeah, what I think is interesting about TikTok also is from the perspective, because we are, a company that we produce content on social media. It's interesting to me to have learned in retrospect that TikTok had like $1 billion fund to pay content creators to come on their platform and create content in order to become so big. So it kind of almost seems like there's a perception that TikTok just became big organically, or kind of because it was the best product. And I think it did deliver something that other social media companies weren't doing at the time, but also there was a very specific plan and funding to get more and more people onto their platform. And it wasn't like an accident that people are creating content on TikTok and not on Instagram.
Absolutely. And of course, they were successful at that. And it is a business, and they're competing with other businesses that are trying to be successful. I'm not going to fault them necessarily for being successful at doing that, but there are reasons why, from our national interest perspective, it's a bad idea to have a company that essentially in 2021 has been taken over by the Chinese state, that is ByteDance, CEO and founder forced out. Its board has been reorganized in such a way in which the state has much more control over what ByteDance does and doesn't do, for us to allow that to continue to operate unfettered in the United States.
I'm just salty that China Uncensored never got any of that $1 billion fund.
Yeah, if only we had been on TikTok, that would have been a great business decision for us.
Yep. What could have been? Yes.
Yes.
So besides exporting social media into the United States, one of the things that the CCP is exporting, and something you've written quite a bit about, is fentanyl. So, fentanyl is an extraordinarily serious issue. It is by far the leading cause of death for people under 45 in the United States.
Yep.
It's killing something like 70,000 Americans a year.
200 a day.
Sorry?
200 a day.
200 a day. This is insane to me. But what's really insane is that this is not a random thing. Like, this doesn't just happen to be the new drug of choice, right?
It's a poison. This is not a drug. I mean, in many cases, people die the first time they use it, and they don't know they're using it, or they don't know they're touching it, right? I mean, 3-year-olds are not dying of drugs. They're being poisoned. That's what's happening. Police officers touch fentanyl in somebody's pocket are not dying of drug overdose. They're being poisoned.
Right. I mean, from what I understand, there are medical, in the past, there have been medical prescriptions for fentanyl, right, as a legitimate pharmaceutical, but that is just not what we're seeing right now.
Right. I mean, it's a broad category, like opioid. I mean, it's a broad category of drugs and chemicals that are used to make these things. And it requires a sophisticated chemical and pharmaceutical industrial base to produce these chemicals, right? So, I mean, we should be very clear that the concern we have from China is the production and export of those precursors, those chemicals that are made by chemical companies and pharmaceutical companies for the express purpose of creating fentanyl.
So, to what degree is the Chinese Communist Party behind fentanyl in the United States?
Well, I think the bipartisan House Select Committee provided. I think your readers or your watchers should go and look it up. But in April of this year, provided a report that sort of looked at the details of the party's culpability in both the production and export of these precursors, as well as the turning a blind eye to all the money laundering that allows this drug trade to happen through Mexico, but also through Canada into the United States. For a country that can erase all references to June 4th, 1989 within a matter of seconds across an internet of 1.4 billion, I find it a bit inconceivable that Beijing doesn't have the ability to control the production and export of these chemicals if it chose to. And we also have evidence that, and this is what the House Select Committee has pointed out, is that we have evidence that the Chinese government has set up an export subsidy regime to compensate those companies, chemical companies and pharmaceutical companies, that make fentanyl precursors and export them. Now, those things are illegal to sell inside China, but they actually get a subsidy to sell them outside of China.
And so they're selling them to like Mexican drug cartels who then sort of assemble those.
The United States. It's
okay.
They've since mostly shifted to then Mexican drug cartels as the way in which they send those chemical precursors.
So, it seems like, well, if the United States can just get China to agree to stop the fentanyl crisis, then maybe they will, right? I mean, both Trump and Biden have talked with Xi Jinping about this and gotten Xi Jinping to promise that he was going to rein it in. So why hasn't that worked?
Because it's not in their interest to stop this crisis from happening. So, I mean, again, I'm, it's a bit mind-boggling to me that Beijing would choose to try and fix something that they see as fundamentally harming their rival. And I find it disturbing that we are not openly talking about that, right? That we are somehow excusing this behavior, intentional behavior. They know exactly what's happening. And to say that this is just an American problem, it's not our problem, and that if you want us to address it, you need to do some things for us, right? A very sort of extortion-esque kind of response, and I find that deeply sickening. As 200 Americans die every day.
Why do you think the U.S. government kind of treats it like, the message that comes across is like, oh, they're trying, like the Chinese government is trying to rein it in, it's hard for them,
It's a really big country, they barely have a bureaucracy that can work, right? All these sort of excuses. Yeah.
Yeah, there's one. I've never heard of China being accused of having too little bureaucracy before. But
no, this is just a really complex problem. If only they could get the information from us of who's doing this, as if China doesn't actually have a way to collect information on terrible and bad things that are happening inside their own country.
Do you think this is something that these officials believe, or are they trying to do some kind of like weird face saving thing?
Yeah, I still don't. I don't understand the position. I mean, part of it, I suspect, part of it arises from just the absolute unwillingness to contemplate that a foreign power would purposefully do this to us. Maybe it's a failure of imagination, because it would seem that the idea of causing massive social problems with the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans, when China views itself as in a long-term and existential struggle with the United States, something that weakens us, is in their interest to continue.
Yeah. We can also see how China can definitely imagine a foreign power doing this to them, right? I mean, because they're thinking back 150 years ago to when the British were exporting opium to China, and it was weakening China. And I think that they're to say they're salty about it would be an understatement.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it is the foundation of the century of humiliation and the entire sort of narrative around victimization. So I know the administration has announced some progress. So China has listed a handful of chemicals, but of course there are hundreds. And each time something is blocked, a simple tweak to the chemical makeup, and then you have a whole new one. And it appears, at least to me, that entire export subsidy regime has not been taken down.
So if somehow China were to actually stop allowing exports of these fentanyl precursor chemicals, would that actually stop the fentanyl crisis in the US? Because people in the US are still buying drugs and have been since long before fentanyl was an issue. I mean, can't American drug dealers just make it in their basement or a camper van like in Breaking Bad when they made meth?
Yeah, so I think one thing is to clear the chemicals that are these precursors that are being used require an industrial base to be able to make, right? So these are a bit different than the things that were around methamphetamines. Certainly different than growing poppies and making heroin, right? I mean, of course, those are all terrible problems as well, and things that have infected and have afflicted the United States for a long period of time and have led to many deaths. But looking at DA's numbers and FDA's numbers and others, I mean, we see like a hockey stick spike in deaths as fentanyl has vastly outpaced the deaths that have been caused by others, right? And so, it's because sometimes this is laced into other drugs, right? So folks they think they're taking like an ecstasy pill, and it's actually been laced with fentanyl. That causes their death, right? So, recreational drug users are then dying from these things. I mean, that's not exactly in the interests of presumably of a drug dealer that would want to keep those people buying more of them. So it's a terrible situation, and I wish we would take it more seriously.
Is there anything specifically that you think the U.S. administration or Congress can do to not just get Xi Jinping to agree to stop, but to actually completely stop this flow of fentanyl from China?
Well, first of all, I think
precursors.
Likely an enormous amount has been exported over the past 5 years, in which it would take years, if not decades, for all of the precursors that have already been exported to for the inventory to work its way down. I mean, I don't know what those numbers are, but I think we should be very clear to ourselves that if China decided to stop today, it wouldn't mean that deaths would stop tomorrow because it ran out. There would be an inventory that's there that would last a long period of time. I think we should be very straightforward about their culpability. Covering for them and pretending that they're not culpable and they're trying hard is not helpful.
Right. But I mean, so if China's policies towards fentanyl precursor exports is directly leading to the deaths of Americans, wouldn't that in many respects be an act of war?
Well, certainly one could consider that an act of war. I think Beijing likely assumes that they are doing something that is gray zone, that is beneath the level that is going to incur the wrath of the United States. And the reason why they believe that is that it It has been done now for years, and it has not incurred the wrath of the United States. We've made excuses for them.
There's also another aspect, and you touched on this, which is the money laundering. So Chinese banks, including state-owned banks, have been helping Mexican drug cartels launder their fentanyl drug money. Can the U.S. do something about this, and would that make a dent?
It would be spectacular if the U.S. Treasury took this as seriously as we take other financial crimes. Yeah, I think they could. They have not chosen to do so yet.
I kind of want to ask, because you've had experience working in government on both the defense and national security side related to China and in the Commerce Department related to China.
Yeah.
Were there similarities or differences in your experience, like approaching China from these angles?
I think, I certainly gained different perspectives as I moved to different portions of the U.S. government and got to understand how different departments and agencies, viewed the U.S.-China relationship, what different departments and agencies thought were their missions. I think we should be clear that for a long period of time, U.S. strategy towards China, our policy towards China, was predicated upon a belief that if China's economy developed, if China became wealthier, more technologically advanced, that would lead to a political liberalization, which was in our interest to have happen. That they would become a partner with us in maintaining an international order that was mutually beneficial to both of our interests, right? That was sort of our assumption. So in large measure, that meant that economic departments and agencies' job was to help the Chinese economy grow. Now, our national security departments and agencies, their job was to hedge against risk and to prepare for worst case scenarios, right? It isn't as if during this period of time we had no national security challenges with China. I mean, the third Taiwan Strait crisis in 1995 and 1996 certainly was a period of really heightened tensions between the two countries. And so we've had these issues, but we were pursuing this sort of two-track approach, right? Economic departments and agencies help the Chinese economy develop. National security departments and agencies hedge against worst-case scenarios. And as our policies change from one of and I'll use a shorthand, engagement, right? That's that economic development leads to political liberalization, and we move to a competitive strategy. It was very hard for the economic departments and agencies to understand that their primary missions were changing, right? That their job wasn't to help the Chinese economy anymore. Their job was to make sure the Chinese economy didn't work as well. And that was a very difficult thing for them to sink in. And it's still deeply debated. I mean, when you watch Secretary Yellen give speeches at Johns Hopkins back in April of 2023, she's very clear that her purpose is to build a mutually beneficial economic relationship with China. That seems to be in tension with the broader White House policy, but that just gets to show that there are still deep divisions across U.S. bureaucracy on what our policy is and what different departments and agencies should be doing.
Well, in the 20th century, the U.S. supported investment in and the economic growth of certain fascist countries such as South Korea and Taiwan. And both of those countries did liberalize into democracies. So it might make sense to think that could be the same with the People's Republic of China, but it has not been that at all. Why do you think it has been so different of a trajectory with the PRC?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't use fascist to describe South Korea and Taiwan in the 70s and 80s. I'd probably use, they were certainly sort of authoritarian, certainly, controlled by sort of, parties that controlled the military. But your point is that in those cases, we chose to use economic inducements to persuade those leaders that they were better off in allowing for political reforms to happen. And it was successful. So it was not unreasonable to assume that a similar approach with the PRC would work. And I would contend that that's also what we assumed with the Russian Federation. It's what we assumed with the former communist states of Eastern Europe, is that by embracing them, bringing them into the economic system, enabling their economic growth, that it would create the conditions for political reforms to happen. That's not an unreasonable policy, but I think we should be clear that it doesn't always work. And so where we are now is that we had a Chinese Communist Party that understood the policy we were seeking to achieve, right? And that the Chinese Communist Party would be the loser in that policy. I think the Chinese people would have been the big winner in that policy. But for the party, they understood that they would be the losers in that policy. And under Xi Jinping, they have sought to steel themselves to that policy and move into a competitive Cold War with the United States. And we've been a little bit slow in understanding that transition. They thought we were undermining them because we were, and they reacted. And now we are having to change our own policies. And that's the dynamic that we're in. Yeah.
Do you think that the U.S. has a whole of government approach to China? Like, do you think that that is a useful thing to do?
Yeah. So again, as I kind of laid out, we have had in the past a whole of government approach. And that approach was sort of on two tracks: help the Chinese economy grow, hedge against risk. As we've shifted to a more competitive policy, one of strategic competition, of long-term rivalry, our economic departments and agencies have not made the shift to what would be the new, what they would be doing underneath that new policy. There has been some, certainly, we are watching, my hat's off to Secretary Raimondo and her team at the Commerce Department in doing a good chunk of this work, right? Moving things in a real direction. But it's not clear to me that the Treasury Department fully feels that. I think they still largely value the stability of the global economic system and the global financial system as more important than putting pressure on China. And those are policy choices, right? That's essentially what's happened. I think that they should be aligning that much more. I think they should be taking more action. But I understand that that is an open debate.
Is that, do you think, a legitimate idea here, that if the U.S. were to pull out of China, or the U.S. were to really stop the investment in China, that could crash not just the Chinese economy, but the global economy, putting Americans in serious financial problems?
I think that is a risk, and I think that's something that has to be accounted for. Policymakers need to be accounting for a variety of different risks. Although I do believe that sending a clear message to Americans and others that the U.S. government is no longer going to act in ways in which we help the Chinese economy sends the right messages through the market for people to recalibrate themselves and get themselves into better positions, right? That business leaders then understand the dynamics that are happening, right? And they understand that if I'm going to build a business, or I'm going to continue to operate a business, I need to account for the geopolitical risks that are now being made very obvious to me. And then in doing so, they'll make their own changes. I think certainly extreme and rapid shifts cause significant risk to a global economy, but a strong, consistent signal to move away allows businesses and the global economy to adapt. So again, that's why I think it's incredibly important for our economic departments and agencies to be sending very clear messages to U.S. businesses and to U.S. investors and to foreign investors that the game has changed. We're not helping anymore.
I think both the Democrats and the Republicans have talked about things related to the hollowing out of U.S. manufacturing, some of the issues that have come to America from globalization, and a large part of this manufacturing was moved to China over the last 20-some years. Is there that acknowledgement within like the U.S. Government's policymaking that if we are helping China's economy, we are also in some ways hurting the U.S. economy, or do they think that you can have both? You can strengthen U.S. manufacturing, which obviously the Biden administration, the Trump administration all wanted to do and have put policies in place to do that, and Congress has passed bills to do that, while also still supporting the Chinese economy.
Yeah. I mean, I think for a good period of time, say mid '90s to the early 2010s, the broad policy assumption was that our economic relationship was mutually beneficial, right? That China got benefits from this economic approach, and the United States received equal benefits from that. That began to change as the China shock materialized, right? So the China shock being the article written in the National Bureau of Economic Analysis, or I'm forgetting the journal title, but sort of early 2016, right? Beginning to sort of say that maybe all the things that happened were not completely mutually beneficial, and it began to sort of sink in. One, that China had not fulfilled its commitments under entry into the WTO. Right, most countries are not allowed into the WTO until they're already a market economy. We gave Beijing a pass to come into the WTO and gain all the benefits of it, and then gave them 15 years to become a market economy, which they never did. And so the impacts that had on the economic system and on U.S. manufacturing and the jobs that were associated with it was significant. And it certainly had outsized impacts on localized communities. And of course, those are the same communities that are largely being impacted by fentanyl. So all of those sorts of things add up. But that understanding that perhaps this isn't mutually beneficial probably did not really start to sink in until the early to mid 2010s. And now we've been in a new where there is deep debate over how harmful is it? Because of course some companies are still there and gain significant benefit, revenue benefit from being in China and manufacturing there. And then how do we weigh that against costs that are happening to others? Of course, that's a political, in our system, that's a political set of decisions, and that's still being battled over. I suspect that we've reached sort of the peak of excitement by U.S. businesses about China, and they're going to move in other directions, and then that will play out over time. That doesn't mean that I'm saying that we've reached a peak of the Chinese economy. I mean a peak of Americans being excited about China. I think we've sort of begun to move on, and we'll recalibrate our economy and our expectations of what the relationship is.
I know you said that there is risk to like making large sudden shifts in policy. I just wonder if we're maybe about a decade behind in terms of like where we should be viewing what's happening geopolitically, policy wise, with what's happening on the ground.
I worry about that too. I worry that we have fretted away a critical decade already. I mean, the Biden administration came in with its national security and identified that the next decade was critical, but I think the preceding decade was also critical. And in terms of dispense, so again, if our strategy had been, bet on the Chinese economy and it'll politically reform while we use the military to hedge against risk, as that first thing didn't play out, we didn't actually invest in the hedging side, because 2013 we implemented sequestration, and we've had a decade of continuing resolutions, which essentially destroyed the Department of Defense's ability to conduct modernization and to build out a future military. And so we have lost that decade, and that's both political parties are responsible for that. And we are now in a much more difficult position. And I don't think for most policymakers, the divide between people in the national security space and people in the economic space, people in the economic space largely think that the military stuff is all incredibly well invested and there's no question about its capability. The people in the national security space are deeply concerned that a decade of underinvestment has really weakened the foundations of that, and therefore we're not actually in a good position. And so I'm deeply concerned.
So, what advice would you give the next U.S. president? And we'll have a new one in January. If you could give him or her one specific piece of advice for how to handle things with respect to China, what would that be?
I mean, speak clearly to the American people. Go back and pull a page from Harry Truman in 1948, 1949, talking to the American people about the challenges that we were going to face with the Soviet Union. The American people in those years did not want to hear that, right? They'd just come out of a long, incredibly destructive war. They just wanted to get back to dealing with their own problems. They didn't want to have to deal with the rest of the world's problems, right? They wanted to finish out the New Deal, right? They wanted to expand you had a whole bunch of excitement about we should solve problems at home. And I think Harry Truman was right to tell the American people that we can't pick the easy path. Like, it's just not responsible to do so, because this will come back to bite us. This will be a huge problem for us. And he made those tough calls. And I would recommend that he or she should look at that and learn from those decisions. It didn't endear people to Harry Truman at the time, but his reputation has improved with time, given those decisions.
What about to, our general audience, like American people around the world who are concerned about China? They are not necessarily policymakers. Is there anything they can do?
Well, I mean, they're going to have to. I think they're going to have to support, some real decisions and sacrifices, right? That, like, the time of easy solutions is gone. Like, we don't have easy solutions anymore. We're going to have to make hard calls, and we're going to have to make some decisions about priorities. And that's tough. I know it is, but obviously your viewers understand these issues, and they need to be making, I think, reasonable arguments to their friends and families about, listen, the world is just not what it was a decade or two ago in the glow of the post-Cold War world. We're back into the same hostile and dangerous geopolitical rivalries, and those are going to be with us until we actually step up and do some things to fix it. It can't be done on the cheap.
And I suppose I have one final piece of advice to add to people watching this, which is to read your Substack, which has countless fantastic articles about what's happening with China. And we're going to put a link below. But you want to tell us a bit about what you do on Substack?
Yeah, for about the last 5 years, I've been publishing a weekly newsletter that pulls together reporting on China from around the world. I add some commentary in myself, but I think that it's absolutely necessary for folks to see what media outlets from around the world are saying about what the Chinese are doing. I've been, my eyes have been opened over the last 5 years of doing this to see just how great the level of journalism and professionalism by folks that report on China day in, day out, who are, don't flinch away from the challenges that they see. I've been really quite heartened by that. And I'm, my hat's off to the community of journalists out there that are doing this hard work. And I just want to highlight their work, as well as think tankers from think tanks around the world that write reports. The content that is generated around China policy, I think, is top notch, and people should be aware of it.
All right. Well, we're going to put a link below. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining us on China Unscripted. Really appreciate it. This has been scary. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me, and have a great day.
So honestly, I kind of think that the theme of this podcast interview has been that a lot of people have been in denial for too long, not just in the U.S. government about China,
but also in that river in Egypt. I've just completely undermined your point.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Okay. At least we ran off the rails really quickly this time. Yeah, but what I was going to say is that, it's not just the US government's policy towards China, but also Xi Jinping's policy towards the economy. It's just like there's lots of denial all around against the reality of what the world is.
I mean, do you think Xi Jinping is really in denial that his policies to preserve party power are at odds with the development of the Chinese economy?
I honestly don't know because I don't know what he's hearing from his advisors either. If you have this situation where the CCP is like the absolute power and Xi Jinping is on top of the CCP, and if people are afraid to tell him bad news or bad things, right? Or, if he believes that his socialist view of the economic system is going to succeed, do you want to be the one to say that's not going to happen?
Jack Ma tried to be one of the people who said that's not going to happen.
Well, I mean, he did something actually kind of minor.
Oh yeah, no, it was very minor. It was like
he criticized Chinese regulators for over-regulating the tech industry or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, so it's in that kind of environment where everybody has to be a yes man, then I don't know if it's denial, I suppose. It might just be delusion, but
yeah, and Xi Jinping may think that there's a way forward where you somehow motivate people to work for the greater good under socialism. And while I think that ignores some of the most basic realities of human nature, it does seem like that is the early promise of communism, right? That people will work together for the greater good. And, to some degree and in some cases, it may seem to be working for a period of time, but inevitably it turns out horribly, right? But maybe Xi Jinping just doesn't see that for some reason.
I don't think he believes that people will work together. I think he believes that ultimately it's kind of like when you have a strict parent who just believes that their decisions are always the right ones, and in order for them to raise their child properly, they have to control all aspects of the child's life. So there's no way to get other opinions or other inputs into that system.
You speaking from experience?
I knew as soon as I made this analogy that I saw it in your eyes that you were
Wow.
you were gonna go there.
Yeah, well, I mean, you do have stereotypical, Asian parents, right?
Not anymore, I don't.
Oh, this is getting dark. We should wrap it up. Well, thanks for watching China Unscripted. I'm Matt Gnezda.
And I'm Shelley Zhang.
Hopefully you'll be back, and we'll talk to you next time, and Chris will be back.